So given The Killer recently came out, I thought I'd take a look back through David Fincher's entire filmography and rank them for you guys. I only recently did the Tarantino one, so I was hesitant to do another so quickly, but on rewatches my ranking changed drastically from what it's always been before. So I figured why not. So we're gonna go from 12 to 1, spoiler warning for all of these of course, so let's just get into what we have at number 12, which is The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Now listen, I don't think this movie is awful. I don't think Fincher is capable of making a really bad movie, but I can never get excited about seeing this one. I like the opening story with Daisy telling the story of the clockmaker. I think it ties nicely into the overall story about time going backwards and what that could mean, but in general, there is nothing to really love about this other than maybe one or two other things. It's funny that the opening logo has like buttons in it, by the way, as if it means something integral to the story or the character instead of just like the guy's name. It does vaguely allude to his father's business, but that's not really touched on at all. It gets like maybe 2 lines of dialogue. It does give me a chuckle. I thought a better opening Warner Brothers logo would be an old decrepit one slowly turning shiny and new. I thought it would be more fitting and a better visual representation of the film, but whatever, who cares what I think. But I do think that Old Man Baby is horrific. Me and my friends would have killed baby Benjamin with hammers, I could tell you that much. Also, seeing Old Man Benjamin fall in love with a child is something. Taraji P. Henson is wonderful as always, but her role is very limited, so not much to grab onto there, and I guess the film is just littered with ideas which are either very bizarre and don't work on a sincere level, or are just very uncomfortable to think about. I don't at all really buy the romance between Benjamin and Daisy. I don't think it's developed that well considering the amount of time that's focused on it. I think the one small thread that works extraordinarily well is the relationship between Benjamin and his father. It had a lot of interesting beats, and Jason Fleming plays the difficulty and emotional turmoil of his character so well, but as a whole, I think a concept like this given to someone like Cronenberg would be very different but a lot more interesting. Overall, I think the movie is just barely passable and runs entirely too long. Okay, so next up we have Alien 3. I mean, come on, Alien is an all-time classic, undisputed, a masterclass on sci-fi and horror. Aliens is a James Cameron masterclass on sci-fi and action. Alien 3 is a masterclass on how not to make an alien movie. Being honest, I don't hate this film. I think it's absolutely fine and has some okay ideas, but it's just so slow. The pacing absolutely kills me when the film isn't in the third act. The ugly VFX on the xenomorph is genuinely laughable. There is a single good shot in this movie, and the way this handles the Ripley storyline angers me deeply. In a vacuum, this movie is fine, but as a third installment, it stinks. It immediately kills off Newton Hicks, completely undoing the work put in by Cameron and actively makes the previous movie worse. Ripley's entire arc and death are completely unearned and feel like an unsatisfying conclusion to one of the best final girls in history. Now, to give credit to Fincher, this was his directorial debut, and he was brought on late in pre-production, which had already experienced 3 or 4 script changes. The film was riddled with issues before he was even brought on, and then he was thrown as an inexperienced director into that mix with the promise of his first feature film being a sequel to 2 of the most successful and adored sci-fi movies of all time, so of course he took it. So to give him credit, it's not entirely his mess, but his name's on it, so here we are. I think the best thing I can say about this film is that at least it is an alien resurrection. The prison setting is pretty cool, some of the actors are doing a good job, especially Charles Dance as Clemens, but I just don't think Ripley needed a pseudo-romantic storyline. So yeah, though I want to like it more, it's 11th. Next is Mank. This is a peculiar one because this is the Fincher that feels the least Fincher-y. Of course, there's the obvious black and white color grade and the general style of the film that uses Anderson-like script vignettes that establish a scene and location, but the story itself feels very unlike Fincher. There's not a touch of mystery, there isn't much life or death tension. It's a dramatic but mostly somber retelling of a broken man's existence. Mank is a human and Mank is a character are 2 very different different people, but they share one thing, and that's the tragedy. Whether it's self-inflicted, whether he's a victim of an industry, it all matters not. It's a tragedy and a life. He says in this movie, the narrative is one big circle, like a cinnamon roll, not a straight line pointing to the nearest exit. You cannot capture a man's entire life in 2 hours. All you can hope is to leave the impression. And that's incredibly emblematic of this. Fincher and his father's script aren't attempting to tell the life of Mank or depict accurate descriptions of these events. They are attempting to get a glimpse of who he was as a human, what his soul looked like. And I think they achieve that very well. At the end of this film, I feel like I know who Mank was, even if I get no concrete answers on what he did or should be credited for. Alyssa Wilkinson wrote a great piece about this film for Vox, so go read that if you have the time, but honestly, I just don't love this film. It's an interesting character study, but one that I don't imagine revisiting for any other purpose than a rewatch of Fincher's work. Now we have a controversial pick for 9th, Fight Club. And now before people get on my back, let me again preface, I like this movie. It is a very fine movie that has some very beautiful moments and brilliant performances, but I just don't see what everyone sees. I liked it fine enough when I first watched it, and on every single rewatch since, I've found it just a good time. The toxic masculinity angle was ahead of its time, and though ham-fisted at times, it's handled fairly okay. The twist is pretty cool and makes rewatches fun, but like, I don't know, it just isn't for me. It's one of the only films I didn't rewatch for this ranking because I have zero interest or desire to see it again. I've seen it like 3 times, I get it now. Cool. It's gonna disappoint you guys, but I don't have anything else to say. It's just a good movie, so yeah, it's here. And this next pick seems outrageous sitting above Fight Club, but it's going to be Panic Room. A film up until my most recent watch was much lower on this list, but man, this recent rewatch really sold this film to me. It has some of Fincher's most interesting direction to date, by far his most fun camera work, and I think it really demonstrates how good Fincher is with very little to work with. It's set in one location, which is the house, nearly the entire time, and it never gets old. He squeezes every ounce of tension out of it. It has a small and compact cast, including a young Kristen Stewart who has more range in this thing than basically anything she did since. Fincher is known for, made a career of, making very concise and painstakingly perfect pictures. Every film he's made has required a ridiculous amount of attention, to the point where people have wanted to throttle him during filming. And not to say this film isn't picture perfect to his liking, but it just feels a lot more scrappy and free-flowing than usual with him. It's nice seeing someone as technical as Fincher go back to basics. It feels like this is the debut feature he never got to make. Though not as technically proficient as some of the lower entries on the list, I just love how much fun Fincher seems to be having directing it. Plus, this is a good entry on the Jared Leto getting hurt in movies cinematic universe, and that instantly makes this a heater. Not even to mention Forrest Whitaker and Jodie Foster giving the most sincere and fun performances in the whole film. They're not doing anything too deep, but they are giving it everything in what little their characters have to deal with, and they service the script incredibly well. Great little flick, and one of Fincher's more easily rewatchable and digestible films. Next up is The Game, starring Michael Douglas, and this is one of the more polarizing films in Fincher's filmography. So many people think it's one of the best, while an equal amount of people think it's one of his lesser works. For me, it's somewhere in the middle. I did at one point have this in my top 100 films, but upon reevaluation, I don't think it holds up as well as some of his other works. But of course, it's still higher than others, so it has to have some good qualities, right? And yes, absolutely, it does. I think this is one of the best films in his backlog for a first time watch. It has a sense of focus and intensity and urgency that many of his other films try to achieve but don't come anywhere near close to. It does such a great job of putting you in the mind state of Nicholas, just a huge burst of frantic energy that lasts the entire runtime and will not give up for nothing. This is another one I don't have a lot to say about. I wish I did. I just think it's a truly great movie that carries the same chaotic vigor of something like Uncut Gems. Okay, so next we have The Girl with a Dragon dragon tattoo, which was actually quite low on my ranking before I started this revisit, and I adored it so much on a rewatch and bumped it up a few. Then that very same night I showed the film to my girlfriend for the very first time, and I loved it even more that time, and I bumped it up a spot or two again until it landed here just outside the top 5, but I think given some time, it could leak into there in the future. It's a detective story that operates on the idea that the audience isn't stupid. They don't spell things out often, and Fincher depends on the audience keeping track of everything with him. They rarely go back over already established details, and that's what makes this so fun to watch. Because as you see the characters scramble together to piece this thing into a solved puzzle, you're also doing that without the luxury of the film relaying exposition to you over and over. If you missed a detail, you might just have missed that detail forever. Now, the only thing that killed this film for me was that I had guessed the twist. Well, just the one. I knew it was Martin the whole time, but I didn't, however, guess that Harriet was alive and was under a new identity as a relative. That caught me off so much. And I haven't seen the Swedish film that predates this one, though I plan to. I doubt very much it'll hold a candle to this one. I mean, Daniel Craig and Rooney Mara absolutely carry this film, and it is striking to me that Fincher never wanted to work with Craig again. And I know Fincher wanted to do the sequels for this, but that just never happened, which is hard to imagine the studio not letting happen. The thrills are non-stop, the detective mystery is top tier, and I'm just a sucker for a film where a death in Christopher Plummer's family brings Daniel Craig to a remote location to solve a mystery through the use of interrogating the family and going over the events of the murder with each and every one of them, whilst finding out that they're the worst people you could possibly meet, and one of them's a Nazi, and it's a great movie. You should go and watch it. It's so fantastic. And entering our top 5, we have Gone Girl. And I'm just gonna say this now, more than any of these, if you don't know the ending of this film, go and watch it before it gets spoiled for you, because that's such a difficult thing to avoid these days. It feels like everybody knows it because it's done so incredibly well. Ben Affleck is the star of this one, and once again Fincher is switching up who he wants to work with, and I think at this point it's because Fincher must be looking for the perfect and exact people for every role rather than mold actors he likes into roles. Because Affleck is so perfect as Nick Dunn, and I think it's because, as any paparazzi photo could tell you, Affleck is so great at being a depressed and empty void. There isn't a single moment in this film that doesn't rock. Rosamund Pike plays Amy so well that she tricked a whole group into thinking that she's not a villain, that she's some kind of girl boss. And sure, yeah, Nick was an asshole, a gaslighter, and ultimately a kind of shitty guy, but he was nowhere near deserving the fate she bestowed upon him. And I kind of love that everyone in this film is just masquerading in some kind of way, playing pretend, and everyone is just so bad at it too. It's one of the most intense and heart-racing Fincher films, and it's also one of the funnier Fincher films. But I have not much else to say about it, except that I think it's Fincher at his most curious. The closest to any of his other works I could compare it to is Zodiac for obvious mystery reasons. But Zodiac, although I like it more, feels less focused than Gone Girl, more chaotic, and that's what this film has. Pure focus. Unconcerned with the bullshit and fat, it has a purposefully unsatisfying end which works well for me, but I can see why it wouldn't for others. It's a frustrating but exciting watch. So though I don't think this reaches the heights of some of his other work, it's still great, and of course top 5. Which leads into the next film, which just so happens to be Fincher's latest film, and I tell you something, I stand by this the whole way. It's The Killer, it's top 4, it's amazing. The conversations around this have been so weird and controversial, and I cannot understand why. The film is just so goddamn solid and hilarious. This moment right here may be the funniest thing Fincher has ever done.
Simple.
I love how this film shows the sort of monotony of being an assassin, but also despite all the self-indulgent monologue droning, he fucks up. His obsession with himself doesn't excuse him of human errors. I think this is the most sloppy Fincher to date, but sloppy with precision, if that makes sense. The mystery unfolds in a very scrappy and impromptu way. It's pieced together through desperation and undying will rather than intelligence and calculation. But I think this is very much on purpose, Fincher has made a career on building the perfect detective stories. The winding and extravagant mysteries involving seemingly everyday people, but this time he flips that on his head using a hitman who thinks he's the perfect assassin but in actuality is fascinatingly terrible at his job and fails constantly. It's near enough a black comedy starring Michael Fassbender that I think is going to be endlessly rewatchable. Very upsetting I didn't get to catch this in theaters, but I hope to own a physical release of it soon. Oh, and Tilda Swinton gives the best performance in the whole film. Entering our top 3, we have Seven, and what is there to say about Seven that hasn't already been spewed and vomited again and again in film discourse? It's great and timeless, a 90s noir that upholds everything that makes the genre great and adds more than what wasn't there previously. Brad Pitt kills it, Morgan Freeman kills it, Kevin Spacey kills it, Gwyneth Paltrow kills it, everybody kills it. The aesthetic is grimy and unpleasant, and yet I don't know, I have it at 3rd because I do really love it that much, but I really have nothing to say about it at all, even less original, so sorry for the fans of this one, but yeah, it's 3rd and that's the best I can offer you. Okay, so in our penultimate spot we have Zodiac. This one fights our number 1 constantly. I think it's by very far the best detective mystery story that Fincher has done. Like I would say, most of these films can be ordered in a few other ways. They're fairly close together in rankings, but the jump between Seven and Zodiac is quite big for me. Seven is an exceptional movie, but I think this is a perfect movie. I think what this film does so exceptionally well is balance between the mystery and the characters the mystery impacts. The tagline, "There's more than one way to lose your life to a killer," is so incredibly impactful and brilliant and perfectly encapsulates not only the characters of the story, namely Robert, Toschi and Paul Avery, but also the audience's experience of watching the mystery unfold. You become so engulfed in the events and the riddles upon riddles. It starts out as a slight curiosity, but by the end you're as obsessed as Robert is with trying to figure it out. I know for me, I'm always shouting at the screen saying it's him, and every time I hope it ends differently, but it never does. I always want them to catch the guy and they never do. And that's so impressive because we as the audience know the Zodiac was never captured, so you'd think the stakes were low, but they managed to keep you invested. And that's the trick with Fincher, making the story just as much about the people we don't know as about the guy we do. The script is perfectly paced and the scene in the basement is the closest Fincher ever got to horror, and it terminates my breath. It's a classic and I'll watch it again and again until my heart stops. Seeing this reminds me that Mark Ruffalo and Robert Downey Jr. are actually fantastic actors who deserve so much more than they have. And I'm glad to see Downey get his Oppenheimer moment recently. I'm just waiting on Ruffalo to have his. But that only leaves one spot left, and our number 1 is The Social Network. This to me again is a perfect film. Again, the tagline, "You don't get to 500 million friends without making a few enemies," is just so perfect. Because this isn't a film about Mark Zuckerberg, not the one we know. This is a film about a completely fictionalized Mark Zuckerberg that demonstrates the bitterness and self-victimization a lot of people possess when under circumstances they put themselves in but blame the world for. There's a great quote where Rooney Mara's Erica says at the beginning to Mark, "You are probably going to be a very successful computer person, but you are going to go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd, and I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole." And I think that perfectly sums up Mark's entire journey in this film. But being honest, there's a million great quotes in this thing. Probably the most quotable Fincher film overall. The "I'm 6'5", 220 and there's 2 of me." Drop the just Facebook. And if you guys were the inventors of Facebook, you'd have invented Facebook. And of course...
Sorry, my Prada's at the cleaners! Along with my hoodie and my fuck you flip-flops, you pretentious douchebags!
The performances all round are phenomenal, the directing is sharp and quite clearly laboured over, and Jesse Eisenberg's classic clinical approach to line delivery builds the personality of Mark Zuckerberg in this world so perfectly. Everybody is just executing their character on the most exemplary level possible. Andrew Garfield steals near enough every scene he's in. Rooney Mara, of course, chews the little scenery that she has. Justin Timberlake is surprising surprisingly super well cast and performs everything as smugly as he needed. Even the more underappreciated performances are lively, like Brenda Song, or the understated performances that speak volumes with little to no dialogue like Rashida Jones. I think this is endlessly rewatchable and I'd never give up an opportunity to watch it again. And that's why it's my number one. I have seen it a million times and I'll see it a million more. And that's it. That's every Fincher ranked. Feel free to tell me where I went wrong and where you'd agree. I think he's such an interesting filmmaker and one that's still performing on a very respectable level. I think he truly is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time and his status is very much earned. And though, you know, other great filmmakers like Martin Scorsese had their Killers of the Flower Moon moment, or Christopher Nolan got to have his Oppenheimer moment this year, and Fincher just kind of seems like he's having his The Killer moment, which is nowhere near as great or cinematically relevant in the current landscape, but I just think he's still so solid and deserves just as much respect. So let me know what you think. What's your ranking of his films? Leave them all below. I want to read every single one of them and criticize, and whether it's one from one of the most prestigious currently working directors or not. As always, keep watching movies.